The first time I smoked weed was the first time in my entire life that I ever remember seeing like longevity in my life. Like it was the first time that I ever thought like, whoa, like this is something that perhaps could have a lasting thing. Because before that, the world was a pretty painful experience.
Welcome to Living in the Weeds, a series that explores the lived experiences of neurodivergent people who consume cannabis, with your hosts, Jessica of Jessica Riley Writer and Lucy of Lucy's Natural Remedies. Today's guest is Dr. Miyabe Shields. Miyabe has a Ph.D. in endocannabinoid pharmacology and describes themself as a queer, neurodivergent stoner scientist.
I'm Miyabe. I have my PhD in pharmaceutical sciences. I studied drug discovery within the endocannabinoid system. And talking about neurodivergence and cannabis is actually like at the core of kind of my whole life, because I'm neurodivergent. And when I started using cannabis way back when I was a teenager, I didn't even know that it was medicinal. And I certainly wasn't like using it on a routine of any case, but I was self-medicating. And I ended up, being able to heal through cannabis. I have gone through some difficult times with psychopharmaceuticals, with prescription medications, which I think work for a lot of people and are extremely valuable for how they work for others. But for some people like me, there are like really negative consequences to using single molecule pharmaceuticals. And, cannabis should be an option and it should be talked about. Cannabis displays a lot of the beneficial therapeutic effects that we see from traditional psychopharmaceuticals. And, I went into drug discovery in the endocannabinoid system, and I was looking at, the targets within the endocannabinoid system originally because I wanted to design a new pharmaceutical like for myself. I was like, I will go in and, I'll cure myself, which is ableist. It's not the way that we should be thinking about our brains, but a lot of pharmaceutical research is ableist. And so that was my background. And that's kind of how I got into, science and what I wanted to find. And it was sort of during my PhD that I realized like, cannabis is the best medicine for me. Mechanistically and molecularly, there's evidence that it would not ever be able to be replaced by a pharmaceutical. And at this point, even if they came out with one that would try it, I wouldn't be interested, even though I'd be happy that other people had that option. I just wouldn't be interested for it. I think that cannabis is the best medicine for me. And that's sort of why it fueled me to go outside of the realm of pharmaceutical research and academic research that tends to view cannabis from a negative lens and not take into account a lot of the lived experience that a majority of the cannabis community has. And so after that, I spent time in the industry. I was researching the rare molecules that are occurring only in high heat methods of extraction. So smoking or vaping or dabbing, anything that is inhaled pretty much has heat applied to it. And so I was looking at the differences in the effects based on the differences of the actual molecules that are present, which that's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down. And more recently, I've been talking more about developing like a community education, sort of a different route. I'd say a platform, but it's more like it's just a community, and it's a different way for us to be learning about cannabis and the brain. That's been something I've been really excited about, and I've been excited about exploring is looking at the differences in how neurodivergent people use cannabis, looking at the differences in the overlap between, it's not just all about the mental aspects of cannabis that people benefit from. And it's sort of this whole body thing that is just now getting explored, outside of cannabis. But it's pretty well known that neurodivergent people have different immune system responses in general, are more sensitive in that way, have different gut microbiome and GI sensitivities, like dietary sensitivities. And, cannabis and the endocannabinoid system fits right in the middle of that. So I'm really excited to be here and be talking about this because we're talking like around the subject a lot without ever usually diving into the experience of it, because I think we as scientists lean away from that lived experience as having as much value as clinical science. And I disagree with that. And, I'm clearly biased, but that's where my opinion comes from. And that's where I hope to go, in the future.
So when was the first time that you got high, number one? And then when was the first time you got high and realized that, wait a second, this works different for me. My thoughts are actually clearer than what they told me it was going to be. Because
Okay,
that's
great.
at least.
Yeah, no, great question. I've never been asked that question before. The first time I got high was 15. So, and I did notice that very first time that I got high, first of all, I did get high. I mean, it was like a huge amount, and I was like definitely feeling it. And I did notice a change that at that point, like in like reflecting upon it, it's like, oh yeah, it's medicinal. But like I always say that the first time I smoked weed was the first time in my entire life that I ever remember seeing like longevity in my life. Like it was the first time that I ever thought like, whoa, like this is something that perhaps could have a lasting thing. Because before that, the world was a pretty painful experience, and it just seemed like a really big struggle. And it's still a struggle at times. I mean, it's always going to be a struggle, in different ways. But the difference of like how it interacts with the brain and how, like when I noticed that it was different, I think it probably was soon after that, somewhere along in high school. I kind of got labeled like almost like an encyclopedia. I started becoming like incredibly interested in weed and in the brain. Probably the first like major change that I would say like way later had to do like thinking, oh, that was different for me. Is that cannabis doesn't really give me the munchies. It actually curbs my appetite. And I don't even, in terms of like munchies, like insatiable hunger, I feel like that kind of all the time. Like if I'm not using cannabis, I have no satiation whatsoever. Like I'll eat until I'm physically sick, which is like very uncomfortable. And so in order to like, monitor that or address that previously, if I'm not using cannabis, I've had to like calorie count or like actually just like count my intake. And I'm constantly feeling like not satiated. But when I use cannabis regularly enough, my body has the ability to feel satiation. That's a weird one. And there's a lot of evidence linking the endocannabinoid system and the activation of cannabis to like hormone regulation of hunger. So there's something different going on there. And yeah, I think it probably hit me that I was reacting differently to it, like in my late 20s, like during my PhD, because it took me taking a step away from cannabis to actually see it as a medicine for what it was. And I kind of just assumed that for the stereotypes about it, making people lazy and making people stupid and like working to excess, I kind of had assumed previous to that this had to do more with dosing and regulation and lack of awareness of like medicinal effects and medicinal properties. It was a big moment when I realized that it could be medicinal just in general. And that shift was huge. And that was about like 5 or 6 years ago that I like actively was able to make the switch over to be like, oh no, this is like clearly a medicine. It's regulating me.
Yeah. That's beautiful. The way you're talking about how we got you to see, longevity in life. Like that is so counterintuitive because people are like, oh, stoners have no memory. Like, so how could you even think, forward like that if you have, forget memory loss from that? So that's pretty cool. And then you mentioned the diet, how you reacted differently from munchies. I'm wondering if you just ended up looking at with a lot of THCV in your cannabis. Because I've heard that's supposed to be like an appetite suppressant.
It is funny too, because like I've been thinking more about what I do and don't gravitate towards. And I've been working towards evaluating that for a long time. Like I like outdoor grow stuff, like lower THC in general. But yeah, I like spicy food. And like I really like capsaicin, which is the spicy molecule in most like peppers, like chili peppers, jalapenos, habanero. And that molecule activates a receptor called the TRPV receptors. It's like a big class of receptors. Some of them are the taste buds. That's why you taste spiciness. But some weed that tastes spicy usually that's attributed to the variants like THCV or CBDV because they have activity at that receptor. So like it's pretty common if you have that like spiciness mouthfeel. And like I love that mouthfeel when you're smoking something and it has that like spiciness, that like almost like a residual tingle. Like I'm definitely attracted to it. So it's very lucky. Or it could be very possible that I got lucky with it and that then I sought it out sort of afterwards, right? Like I also like purple weed, and like those anthocyanins are doing something. I feel like they have to be, like, because I have like a high preference for it. So there's so much that we have left to understand, and there's a dose dependency too, right? Like I've been controlling my dosing for years, and so there's a lot of variables. I definitely have been thinking about the THCV thing since you just like brought that out. It's so interesting. I've been thinking about that like recently because of like, I mean, it's also the next hot thing, right? Like a lot of people are talking about it, and I think it's a good thing. I think we need to focus way more on the rare cannabinoids. Like let's continue with that, especially for neurodivergent people.
You had mentioned CBG, and that is a cannabinoid that I am falling more and more in love with. It's been about a year and a half long bromance, if you will. And now I'm just sitting here, and in DC, because I'm in DC / Maryland, and in DC they don't really test for terpenes, and they kind of do tests for cannabinoids, but the growers really aren't focusing on that. In Maryland, they have to have that testing. So it's really nice to be able to go in and say, okay, this has, 1%, CBG or whatever, sometimes even 2% if you're really lucky. What is your experience with that particular cannabinoid and like neurodivergent symptoms? And I guess we should probably talk about some of the symptoms first before we talk about that. So that would be one of my symptoms of my neurospiciness. Sometimes it's hard for me to think linearly.
Yeah, like focusing or like different types of like levels or differences in executive functioning. Like I think that the neurodivergent traits for me and for other people that I've heard from, because also at this point, like one of the things that I love is how many people have shared their personal experiences with me. I feel like I am like, I want to be able to represent others and their experiences besides my own, because there's a lot that we have in common, but there's also a lot that's like different, right? We're all very unique. And I started experimenting with CBG like 2 or 3 years ago. And I do feel like whenever you introduce something new into your routine and things to do, I mean, I think it takes time to really, truly vet out and understand like what it's doing and how it helps you and how to integrate it into your life. And so for me, CBG has been a morning thing that has been very, very helpful in like terms of like getting things started and getting up and doing things throughout the day. But I've found the most benefit from mixing it in with CBD and THC flower, like to mix all the flowers together. And I've been finding it helpful that when I mix all those things together, it is just a more reproducible experience. And that's been my main like number one benefit, is that I've been able to create like a blend that for me is almost always the same experience, which is helpful for it as a medicine. But like in terms of like the specific efficacy of CBG that I think people should look for if they are searching for something that is not quite as altering or intoxicating as THC, but is also more than CBD, because hemp, like cannabis and CBD, even if it has that little bit of THC in the full spectrum when you're taking it, for the most part is incredibly mild. And for me leans more towards like the sedation side of things, where it's like, it's mild, it's anti-anxiety, it's calming, it's a relaxing thing, but it's not necessarily like a productivity thing. It's not necessarily something that's going to help you to accomplish tasks in a certain day if you want to, or like what you were saying about like the linearity of your thoughts, like the organization and an ability to like do obligations that we all have to do in order to continue to like exist, because our lives are extremely complicated now. I mean, we used to be far simpler, like evolutionarily, like our brains really weren't evolved to handle like some and the extents of the stresses that we're now put through and that are mandated upon us. And so I've found that CBG has been really helpful for that. So for focus, productivity, those are the two like positive like modifiers that I've seen, and then like a little bit of pain and inflammation, and like there's differences there. It's kind of, I kind of view it as right in between CBD and THC in terms of when I'm just like talking about it with like people who are just getting introduced to it. I'd say that it's like, it's somewhere right in between. The pharmacology lines up almost somewhere in between too. I mean, it has its own unique profile, as do all of them, but in terms of the CB1 receptor, it is sort of like right in between the two of them. And I've definitely benefited a lot from putting it into my daily routine. And interestingly, out of all of them, CBG seems to be the one that I like the most in the edible format.
What's your preferred mode of medicating? Is it?
So CBG, I've been like very fortunate to have access to like really great full spectrum tinctures for like a while. So that was how I started experimenting with CBG, and then I had some flower. And in terms of like overall what my favorite method of ingestion is, it is smoking. And this is something that I get a little flack from, so I have to preface it with, I am not advising that anyone else smoke. I'm not suggesting that it is better or like that it is superior to like say dry herb vaping, which you don't get combustion or pyrolysis, or edibles. But I am saying that it is a different therapeutic profile. My brain certainly reacts differently to it. There are different molecules involved. Yes, some of them are likely to be negative, but like for me, the net benefit of like getting the experience out of cannabis that I want by smoking is beneficial and useful, and is definitely my favorite. Like my favorite mode or method is to smoke joints. Like previously it was spliffs, but I can't do that because of the nicotine. Like I need to really stay away from it. But I absolutely prefer joints. They are like my favorite method of smoking and in using cannabis in general. And so I do mix CBG and CBD hemp and THC flower in a mixture. And that's kind of like my bread and butter. Although, I mean, like I've been dabbling a little more in the dabs, and I think they'd probably consider me in the micro dab category for for the amounts. I have a very low tolerance. But I can see the benefit of that too. It's different. So yeah, I have done tons of experimentation outside of like just like easy edibles, smoking, dabbing. Like I really love hash. I've been getting more into that. Like, and it is fascinating. That's one of the advantages of cannabis, is that, you know, there are these things that people end up gravitating towards, like in general. And I do think that it seems like in general, people whose brains are a little more like mine, a little more like up, a little more anxious, a little more like extra activity, a little extra like going on in general, tend to lean into the methods that give you the most moderate effects, or the most like sort of like not necessarily racy, like paranoia-y. And so for THC edibles, that tends to happen to me, although I've been able to like figure out ways to work with it, but it's still not, you know, it's still not preferred. But yeah, CBG I like to take CBG tinctures in the morning. I find that to be useful.
I have trouble with edibles because for whatever reason, like it doesn't take a lot to talk me into taking a nap, right? And edibles just call me to my bed every single time, it feels like, no matter what kind I'm having. There's some brands here now that are actually trying to be very good about, you know, when they say sativa, it actually is a sativa-like effect, and that's been okay. But I have to microdose with those, even because if I take like, you know, 2 or 3 of them, I'm like on the floor, drooling, passed out. Like,
I think there's something to be said though too for the ritual of rolling a joint or rolling a blunt or rolling a spliff. The fact that you get to sit down and do something with your hands and then take it back and forth to your mouth. Because even before I started smoking joints, I was always very interested in smoking, like the act of smoking itself. So I think there's something to be said for that.
Yeah,
just totally.
Or on the joints.
Yeah, I mean, I also smoked cigarettes before I smoked weed, so like I have that whole oral fixation situation going on as well. And like but with edibles, like for me, like it is a body. I mean, I've talked to this thing like over and over again, because I've tried to be like, okay, edibles are the gold standard for, in terms of pharmaceuticals, it's called oral administration, and that is like the gold standard for how to get a medicine into the body, right? I mean, like that's why pills are pills. They're easy, they're dosable, so that is the thing. But I also the advantage of edibles that they last very long is an advantage, but for me also it's not. Like I kind of like the up and down of smoking, that it's pretty quick and that you can titrate yourself into a certain level like pretty easily. You could stop a quarter to a halfway through a joint, you can finish the whole thing, but you can control it in a way that is easier. And I also enjoy that it's relatively short and that you can choose whether or not you redose again, as opposed to like it just being like kind of a long constant that does end up like, for me, like feeling like a weird mixture of being body tired and mind anxious. Like, and the unknown of that, I think, is kind of where, that's a neurodivergent vulnerability, is that some people who are more vulnerable to like these other effects, or to the effects just being more variable. Like if your brain is more sensitive, it's possible that everyone it's not just possible. It's likely that everyone just has these spectrums of responses to edibles, to smoking, to specific formulations. And it's just that neurodivergent people are more sensitive to that variability and more sensitive to certain negative effects that kind of come about. And so that's kind of where either that like high preference comes from, or where like a lot of trial and error is necessary. It's also why I think that it's important to talk about like introducing cannabis if you're neurodivergent, and like what you should and shouldn't be aware of. You should just be very aware of all of the things and like write it down. Like, are your eyes very dry? Is your mouth very dry? Usually those things go away with tolerance, but does it not go away? Right? Like, because that's a sensitivity to smoking that people seem to have, that smoking in general will cause that more than other methods. And it depends from person. Like I haven't had cotton mouth since I was like a teenager, right? Like,
yeah. I was going to ask, so we don't have to disclose everybody's ages, but I've been smoking for almost 3 decades now. And I've noticed a difference in how things are now as they were back then, which makes me feel extremely old, because I remember being told that when I first started smoking weed, right? To now where I'm like giving my mom instructions on how to go to the dispensary so she can get something for her arthritis, right? Like it's night and day. But by the same token, the weed has just gotten stronger. And I've noticed a change even in the last couple of years. And I wanted to see if, talk about that with you, if you had noticed that, because I've had to drastically cut back in my intake because I wasn't aware. I tell my friends, like, it's like I would, like, you drink a glass of wine every night, with your dinner. Imagine somebody switched it with Everclear and you didn't know, right? And you think your perception of life is still the same, because if you're a chronic smoker who is using it for, for mood stabilization, for focus, for other areas of your neurospiciness, right? A lot of it being your perception, and that perception is now completely skewed, right? I wanted to know what your takes were on it, because and one last thing, like my shirt says, stray names come and go, but terpenes are forever, right? Because
I love that.
Well, that's what I try to teach people. Like learn your terpenes, learn your cannabinoids, and you can go anywhere, and it doesn't matter what they've named it. You can hopefully look at the cannabinoid profile and figure out how you might, how it's going to hit you, right? So what are your takes on it? Because I know Jessica and I, we've talked about it and we have our theories on it, but we can't pull out all the science and be like, oh, that's because this molecule over here is interacting with this structure in your body.
I think I'd equate it to like dog breeding and how we've like bred certain dogs for certain purposes. Like we have like the working dogs that do the like working job, the herding dogs, the gun pointing dogs. Then we have like the dogs that we bred to fight. And then there's like this next level of dog breeding that's actually really negative. And it's like to the point where it makes the dogs unhealthy. And it introduces like health concerns. And I think they're called like designer dogs or something. But like, yeah, and it's really sad because the dogs live lives of pain and suffering. And essentially that's what I feel like we've done with cannabis. Like I feel like we've taken this plant that grows like a weed. The reason why it's called weed is because it grows like one, right? And it is a strong plant that should grow quickly with minimal nutrients added to it, in theory. And no, you're not going to get like the most potent cannabis, but there's all of these other things. There's all these other qualities of cannabis that are not the THC content, that aren't even the terpene content or the cannabinoid content. There are other contents that we don't quantify. In terms of like the pharmacology, when you look at how like these molecules interact in the brain, like the addition of one different one, changes a lot. I mean, I think a good example of that is anyone who's added CBD in with THC, you do get a different effect. And I mean, it's pretty clear that, just by changing this one factor, you could have this bigger change in what you experience. And that is also true of all of the other molecules that are in cannabis, including the ones that we've never discovered or that we are limited in our ability to discover and to look at, or ones that are in very, very small amounts that are like either genetically rare or rare because the environment is rare. And something I've been leaning towards in the last few years that I've been trying to like just personally investigate has to do with cannabis that is grown more naturalistically in terms of like just its feeding schedule, like to not feed the cannabis plant like so intensively, and you're not going to get really potent cannabis. And so for a lot of people that would be like, you're not getting like the most out of it, right? But it's like the equivalent of saying like, what if all the wine, to go to the wine example, what if like all the vineyards stopped caring about their bouquets and their like overall legginess of the wine and all of that, and it started being only about the ethanol content? Well, first of all, you get a lot of things that are the same because a lot more of them would be optimized only for that ethanol content. And the more of like just one thing you get, the less of all of the otherness that there will be, and the more overpowering that one thing will be. So in that case, that is kind of how I feel about cannabis and about, hyper potentiating THC or hyper focusing on THC as the marketing value.
I think a lot of the side effects that we're seeing is like people are stressing out their endocannabinoid system. They're burning those receptors. Like when I was in college, it was ecstasy was the big thing, the precursor to Molly, and it was very raw in its form. And so as a result, people's serotonin receptors, serotonin. Thank you. They were burning them effectively, right? And causing permanent damage. So it's like you're getting high and you're feeling happy for 24, 48 hours, but to what detriment, right? And so I can't help but wonder if that's what's going to happen because we see a lot of our influencers out there just taking monstrous dabs, right? And doing it for the content, doing it for the like. And another side, I'm getting old. I worry for the youth.
Same. I worry because for me, I've been smoking for long enough that I've seen a very clear difference in. I mean, first it was access, but I mean, I was from Cali, so it was always like pretty decent, but it was different. And now I think back to like what it looked like, right? Like if we got something that we were like, oh man, this is fire, it was probably like 10 to 15%, like just based on what the flower looked like. Like yeah. If we were like super stoked on it, it'd be 15% maximum, right? Like that would be like the higher percentage. And that is actually where I lean towards my sweet spot personally. And I find that using flower keeps my tolerance low enough that if I did take a dab, I would always be able to reach a different level. There are all these advantages to keeping your tolerance like relatively low. And I think especially within the neurodivergent population, it should be talked about because like what you're saying about like being labeled a drug addict, like there's all these very sensitive, it's sensitive to talk about cannabis in this context because relative to the other drugs, it is not addictive, right? It's not detrimental in that way. And it is safer. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't come with risks. And like, it absolutely can be a negative relationship with a molecule. Like you could get to the point where you're using too much. Absolutely. Whether that too much is financial, whether that too much is like relationships, or whether that too much is productivity based and that you can't be like do the things you need to do to be independent. I mean, I definitely worry about the pens just because of how easy they are. The fact that you can hit them like inside, I mean, that makes them useful at times, right? Like business conferences, like it could be useful, but at the same time, like I absolutely worry about it too. Especially because we don't have that, like it's so hard to talk about that without being like, I'm not trying to be like a fear monger. I love cannabis and I use it every day. But at the same time, like, yeah, we absolutely could be doing more talking about like, what does a routine look like? Like if you are going to use for the rest of your life, which like when that was a decision that was made by me, it's like, yeah, I'm going to use this for the rest of my life. Like, can you make conscious decisions about that use that would reduce risk or that would be like more towards maximizing your benefits? Like, absolutely. And I think part of that is, first of all, realizing what you're even using cannabis for. For some of us, we've been using it for so long that it's like part of who we are. Like for me, like I am like it is just myself, right? Like, and to actually make that like understanding of what I was using it for, I had to stop using cannabis and kind of like reevaluate. And that was just my own personal journey. For some people, stopping is extremely painful, and it's not something like stopping all the way is not something that's realistic. And so we're all different, but like having that realization of like, what is this going to look like in the long term? What is the long-term like benefit of it? And trying to find that net benefit of like, there's pros and cons to everything in life. Like every time I love boba. And every time I drink a boba, I'm like, oh my gosh, this thing has so much sugar in it. It's like certainly cancer causing because sugar causes cancer. But like, it's all this net benefit. It's this net benefit, right? Of being like, oh, but I love boba and this experience will make me absolutely happy like right now. And it's this like evaluation of it that, when you start to think about it with everything, it becomes like a little much and it can be overwhelming, and that can be negative in its own way too. But that we should apply a little more of it, I think, to cannabis, especially in the neurodivergent population, like in our community. Like we should apply more of it because we're vulnerable to a lot of things, and like routine and reward seeking and escapism, they all tend to be things that people who are neurodivergent are more vulnerable to, because neurodivergent people have different stresses and pressures upon our life that make the reward of being high greater. Like it makes that reward bigger, because it does improve functions. Like it does improve like anxiety to be able to do things. It does improve quality of life. So it's sort of this balance between seeing all the positives of the improvement of quality of life relative to like what could be negatives, which are like, if you have extreme tolerance, like one of the negative things we're seeing is like hyperemesis, that some people are like sensitive to throwing up or sensitive to nausea and vomiting. And I'm sensitive to that for sure. I mean, I get that a little bit. I have GERD issues and I get nausea in the morning as well, like from anxiety. So like I'm already sensitive to that as well. And I've seen now like there's like genetic links that are coming out with it, but that some people will actually get really like violent and extreme and severe responses to this extreme tolerance. That in general, it's different from person to person, but it seems like in general is linked to like very, very heavy use, like very, very like on the extreme level of use, where we're saying, okay, cannabis is safe. There is no acute overdose of cannabis. It is safe. But what is advisable, right? And that's the problem with us not having like our medical professionals on board, and a lot of it being up to the community and up to our own individual like ability to monitor ourselves, to like do the work on our own, which is, it's a big ask. So, a piece of that has to do with the fact that we're not allowed to smell and look at the cannabis anymore. Like my original, like my first medical experience was in California before we tested for THC, or at least the places that I went to didn't test for THC. So it was just like high, mids, and lows. And like, also, like, I think it's funny that there's trends being like, bring back the mids. It's like, yeah, absolutely. There's medicinal value in mids and lows in different ways. And we used to be able to look at it, right? Like you'd open up this giant jar, smell it, look at it. There's something about like, there's differences in the density and the structure. And there's so much there that is minimally investigated so far, but that we do know qualitatively in the community, it's pretty known that there's more than just THC. But it hasn't yet gotten to that point of like in reaching into the general public yet, because unfortunately, without that lack of knowledge, someone goes into a dispensary and they have $60 to spend. They're kind of like, well, I want to spend the $60 on something that's the biggest, bang for your buck. And it's just a barrier of, to me, it's a barrier of education, but it's also a barrier of understanding of like, okay, but that might also come with more side effects.